Hello, welcome. I'm Savalian. I make videos about game development, games, creativity, and some lifestyle stuff. And today we're going to be doing a sort of productivity video, and it's going to be a long one because we're going to build a very involved Notion template for tracking tasks and goals and sort of planning out your time and your life. I've been using Notion for a while. I made one template last year that's pretty good, but in the meantime, Notion has released a lot of new features, but I wanted to incorporate some of these new features into my template that I use. So I thought I would build one, show you how I'm building it, and then also release another template. If you don't want to do all this work, you can just pick it up on my KoFi shop. But if you don't want to buy it, or if you can't buy it, you can just follow this video. I won't be going super in detail into how to do all this stuff. I'm kind of assuming you have used Notion before and you kind of know the basics. And at this point, there should already be a shorter video that talks about how to use the template that you can watch if you don't want to go into the build process, if you just want to see what it does and how it works. So this template and the previous one are both sort of inspired by the 12-week year, because that is how I like to organize my goals and tasks. So at a high level for me, I have this quarterly set of goals, and then I break each of those goals down into weekly objectives, weekly tasks that are very actionable and, most importantly, quantifiable, so I can measure my progress numerically. And so that's the goal going into this, is that I want a system that will support the breakdown of tasks into larger chunks and smaller chunks, and connect each of these chunks to different sort of time frames. And the cool thing is that because Notion's subtask or subpage feature makes things so flexible, you can definitely build this and just use it differently than I do. With maybe you want to do yearly goals with monthly like smaller sub goals and weekly smaller sub goals. Maybe you want to do something like that. With this system you can. So the very first thing I do with every template is build out the databases first. So I have data to work with, so I have the structure of the data. Notion databases are basically just ways to store a lot of pieces of information that all have the same properties on them, and then you can relate these items to other items either within the same database or in other databases. And I like to add my databases on their own pages, so they're always separate from the views where I'm actually looking at them in the dashboard area. I've added some pages at the bottom of the template, just right on the front of the dashboard. To add the database, we could do /database full page, and we can just start building it out. We are going to build the tasks database first, which of course is going to use these sub pages to great effect, I think. So they've added a way to establish this parent-child relationship between items in a database. There's a little option in the menu here to enable it. You can give a name for each side of the relationship basically, and I'm going to use sub and super as the sort of keywords for child relationships and parent relationships, kind of like that. So Subtask and Supertask are going to be the ones for tasks. And as I build out templates, I always add test data so I can see how everything works together. I'll delete all of this before I publish the template, so it'll be empty and clean. And next I'm adding the status field. For my previous template, I got a little too crazy with the statuses, so I just left this as to do, doing, and done. Nice and simple. I added the initiative property next, which for me is basically just the category of task. Whenever I set up my template, I have a set of initiatives that I use. For the sake of the template, I'm just putting in work and home by default. I tried to do a slick thing where subtasks would take the initiative from their parent if they didn't have one set, but formulas unfortunately don't connect to these select values to show the color. They just copy the text, and I didn't like that. I just really like the little block of color that the select options have, so I just decided to have the user set initiatives for every task. Next we have several date properties, and the footage here is going to be a little bit back and forth because I did most of these earlier in the process, And then I made some adjustments later as I changed kind of how I wanted to do things. But the short version of the story is that I want to support automation with the new button feature, and because formulas cannot output date ranges, only individual dates, in order to get all of that working, we have some things we need to do, some kind of hacky things. So what I want to be able to do here is either set the date manually or set it by including a start date and calculating the date as an offset of that date. So to start, we have the set date. This is just a normal date property, which can have a range in it. Then we have the origin date, which is going to be used as the starting point for calculating an offset date. This is also a normal date property. And then we have a number property, the date offset, which is going to represent how many days or weeks or months or whatever we want to offset this date from that origin date. And then we have an offset date type property, which is going to be fed into the date add function in Notion. So it can be anything that is accepted as a date unit by that function. So we have years, quarters, months, weeks, days. Next we have a property called date, which is actually a formula which grabs the set date if it is not empty. Otherwise it tries to grab the date by an offset. So whether you use set date or the generated offset date, the end result is in this one that's just called date. Now a final piece that is important because of that issue I mentioned with formulas not being able to output date ranges is a formula to calculate the end date, and we are also going to separate. We're going to have a property for the start date and a property for the end date. So for these, if we are using a date property, we can use the functions start and end. We're going to grab the start date with start, pass that property in. And for the end date, we can use end on set date, but if we don't have a set date and we do have an offset date, we can do date add, pass in that start date 1, because we're assuming we're going forward by 1, and then the property will be offset type. So what this is going to do is it's going to start from that starting date, and then it's going to add 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, whatever the calculation was used to offset it by, it's going to use that to find the end. And I do all of this again for the next database, the Timeframe database. Oh, you're going to see all these properties again later. Okay, back to the early steps of this database. I have a few checkboxes coming up to help make filtering database views easier. The first is an is work checkbox meant to mark tasks that are connected to an income stream. This really just makes it show up on some of the views that are meant to review like income. We'll also add a roll-up which will mark subtasks of any work item. So to do this, we'll create that roll-up, select the Supertask relation, the is work checkbox, and then just show original to copy that value down. I have another checkbox where I do the exact same thing. This one is called is content, and it will be used to filter out tasks that are content related. So for the content calendar, or just normal like searching, if you want to search for pieces of content, you can use this. If you don't plan on using your template for anything content related, you can just leave this out, keep things a little cleaner. And now we get into the progress tracking, which gets really complicated because of the hierarchy that we have with the subtasks and the parent tasks. But I think it ends up being really sleek, so stick with me here. The goal here is for each task to have its own progress tracking that then gets measured by the parent tasks or the super tasks, and then if there's a parent above those, it continues going up. So the idea is that you can track progress at any level of your task like hierarchy, and the progress of the lower ones gets rolled up into the progress of the higher ones. And this is really so we can have an overview of how we're doing, that includes everything that we've got going on. This is another set of properties that I came back and made some changes. So I'm going to explain it from the point of view of the final the final set of properties. So first, each task has its own item effort and item total properties. These are just numbers. The total is how many things you need to do for that task. And this is just a number that you come up with when you're making the task. If you want something that's either done or not done, you could just put 1 in here. If you want to do, say, write 3 pages for a task, you could put a 3. It's just a way to track your progress based on numbers that are going to be easy for you to plug in instead of manually having to calculate like, well, this is about 50% done because I've done all these things. So the way that I've done this is to have this item total, and then item effort is how many of those things you've done. So we have effort out of total. Next, we need a roll up to roll up the effort and totals for our subtasks. So add a roll up, pick subtask, item effort, and then sum. Do the same thing to add a roll up for the subtask total, and then choose item total for that, and then sum it as well. And next I added a formula to calculate the percent of each item. And this is easy enough. The formula is just the item effort divided by the item total. And to keep these numbers clean, there's a little trick you can do. You can do your division, multiply that number by 100, round it, and then you can either divide that by 100 to get back to a percentage number, or you can display it as a progress bar and have the progress bar display divided by 100. Now here's where things get a little crazy. In order to get the effort to cascade up through multiple parent-child relationships, we do need a couple more properties here. First, we need a formula property that adds the item effort to the subtask effort, so the roll-up that we just made. And then we need one for total as well. And you might ask why I am keeping the effort and total separate like this instead of just rolling up the percentage. And this is because I want to be able to weight these values. And once we have that formula, which I just called S plus I effort, which is sub plus item effort, and then also S plus I total, we need another roll up which rolls up these formulas. So I'm calling these S plus I effort roll up and S plus I total roll up. And what we're going to select in here is subtask for the relation, S plus I effort for the value, and then sum. And this is the step that actually brings up the total through multiple levels of like parenthood, or I get so confused thinking of how to explain these relationships. And this is the step that actually brings up the total through multiple levels. If you don't have this, if you just have the subtask total, all you ever get is that number going up to the next level. And then finally, we have a progress property, which is a formula. This is the final step. And here we are just going to add the value from S plus I effort roll up to the item effort and divide all that by the S plus I total roll up plus the item total. So be careful with your parentheses here. You want to have the two efforts in the parentheses together and then the two totals in parentheses together so that you are adding those first and then dividing one by the other. I'm also going through and updating the icons for some of these properties, which is a thing you can do now. I think this is a lot of fun. It just makes it look a little bit nicer. And we do have two other sets of values where we need to do this, adding and rolling up and adding and rolling up again sort of thing. And it's going to leave us with a lot of properties on this database, but in the end it's going to be worth it because everything's just going to work so seamlessly. The next set of properties is around hours, and I like to track how much time I'm spending on different things so I can gauge whether I'm spending my time effectively on different projects. So I'm starting with a number property called hours logged. This is where I just enter in how many hours I've spent on that task. And you can include decimals here, so I've just done, 30 minutes, I could put in 0.5. And then we're going to do the same process of rolling up the sub hours, adding them to the current, and then rolling that up. So sub hours is a roll up Then we have s plus I hours, a formula which adds hours logged to sub hours. Next we have a roll up, s plus I hours roll up, which just rolls up that s plus I hours property with sum. And then finally we have all hours, which adds hours logged to s plus I hours roll up. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. I hope after a few repetitions you can kind of see the pattern here. And then also for hours, I like to add a label for displaying it a little bit more cleanly. So when you put properties on something like a calendar or a board or a gallery view, it literally just shows you the number or the value that's in there, unless you hover over it, which can be is just a little bit of extra work. So what I like to do, and I believe I got this little trick from Red Gregory, is add additional properties that are specifically for displaying things nicely. So for this, I'll do an hours label property, and this is a formula. We can just add some text in here within the quotes, and I like to put a little hourglass icon, the word hours with a colon, and then we can add the property value from all hours right in there. I also like to do it so that if hours is empty, it also shows empty. This just cleans up our gallery views a little bit. And now we're almost done with the tasks database. The next thing we're going to do is another set of properties very similar to the previous two around tracking income. If you don't plan on tracking income within Notion, or if you do maybe a salary job where you get paid the same no matter how much work you do, you could probably skip all this. I don't know if it would be super useful, but I have a number of different income streams: YouTube, Twitch, writing, Skillshare, my sticker shop. Hopefully, eventually I'll have some game sales. So I've got a lot of different things going on, and I like to connect the effort I'm putting into work to what I'm actually earning from that work. And I have split the income properties into income and income goal. I don't know if I'll actually use the income goals, since so far my side project income has been really sporadic and unpredictable, but I thought it would be nice to be able to aim for certain targets and see progress bars based on how you've done comparatively. So I put the income goal properties in here. I may or may not use them, but they're in there if you would like to use them. So I start with two number properties, item income and item income goal, and then we are going to do the same steps to roll these values all the way up through the hierarchy. So the sub income roll up with the subtask relation, item income and sum, another one for the income goal. Then a formula property, s plus I income, which just adds item income to sub income. Next, an s plus I income roll up, which rolls up on the subtask relation, the s plus I income property, and sums it. And then finally, the plain just income property is a formula property which adds item income to s plus I income roll up. Alright, I hope this wasn't too confusing. Alright, there, we've done it. Repeat all those steps with the income goal properties of the same names, and you should have income and income goals that cleanly roll all the way up to the higher level tasks. Then I had a little fun with how I want to display these. I have an income progress, which is just a formula which divides the income by the income goal and displays it as a small circular progress bar. I also added a fun label which uses these green dollar sign emojis instead of plain dollar signs. You can take that out if you think it's gaudy, but I thought it was kind of fun to have that pop of color. And of course you can adjust your labels however you like if you want to display it differently. But for this, I do an if statement. If there is a goal, I want to display the income out of the goal amount. Otherwise, I just include the income. It's just a little bit cleaner that way. And then the very last thing I added to the task database is an optional thing for people who want to track values related to their tasks, and I kind of had content in mind for this, but you can use it for other types of metrics as well. And I just called this property metric 1, and you can rename it, but this could be used for tracking views, likes, watch hours, sales, whatever you want really. So I have the number property metric 1 where I am going to plug in the metric, and then a date property for when I grabbed that metric, because sometimes you have things that do accumulate over time, like, YouTube views. On day 1, you're gonna have fewer views probably than day 100 of when you've published it. So I just thought it would be useful to add a date property to see how old that information is. And then I just added a label. This has a cute little star emoji. I put the word views in here just as an example, and then the metric 1 property value. Like I said, this is really an example. You can and should tweak this to what you want to track. And then if you want to track more metrics, you can just duplicate these properties and add more of them. I really didn't want to bog down the template too much for people who don't need to track content metrics, but it's pretty easy to just add additional properties that follow this pattern. I also added a formula later for income per hour, which is just a formula where the income is divided by all hours. And I made a cute little label for that as well, using that green money sign again, just for funsies. And that's everything for tasks. And honestly, even without the rest of the template setup, this is a very powerful database for task tracking. If you don't care about connecting tasks to certain time frames, or if you don't care about setting up the dashboard, you honestly could just stop here. You could just use this, do some filters maybe, and have a very, very powerful tool for tracking all of your tasks and your work. But we are going to continue on to our next database, which is going to add a little bit more structure to the planning process. And this database is going to have timeframes. So I'm going to go back to my main page and create a full page database for the timeframes, just like I did with tasks. And once again, the first thing I want to do is set up the subpages feature. It took me a minute to think of names for these, but in the end I went with subtime and supertime, just like with task, subtask, supertask. I'll put some example timeframes in here so I can see how they all work together as I go. Next I added the set date, which is going to end up working the same as the tasks, where I'll have the set date, but I will also have the ability to generate dates from an offset. And a lot of the things in timeframes are going to be the same as in tasks, because not only do I want that date flexibility, but I want to be able to view summaries of how much of the tasks in the time frame are done. So we are going to need some summarizing properties like that roll up the task progress and everything. So these are going to end up looking very similar to tasks. And you may ask, why have this database at all? Why not just use tasks? And it really just comes down to the fact that I wanted this mental differentiation between the containers for tasks and the tasks themselves, so that I could specify, this is a week and it contains all these other tasks. There are definitely other ways that you could do this, but this is the way that I chose to do it. So next I added the properties for the date offset stuff. First, a number property, date offset, which is the number of days, weeks, or months, or whatever to offset the date by. Then origin date, a date property which represents the starting point for the offset. And then offset type, a select property which has the amounts that you can offset by. So this just says days, weeks, months, and so on. Finally, we have the plain old date property, which is a formula, and here we either return the offset date or the set date depending on what's filled in. So if not empty, date offset, and then we use date add, which takes the starting point as the first parameter, origin date. The second parameter is the offset, so we use date offset there, and then the third parameter is offset type, so we could just pass all of those in. And if it is empty, so the other side of the if statement, we just want to use set date. Next, I have two more formula properties, start date and end date. These are used for some filtering and also for the timelines, which can accept, separate properties for the start and end date. Here is where I also pulled in the percent through formulas that I used on my previous template. These formulas calculate how far you are through a date range. I'll put this formula on the screen, but I grabbed the basic formula from Red Gregory, a fantastic YouTuber who makes a lot of very helpful Notion content. I adapted it a little bit to fit what I needed by first making the percent move by each hour instead of each day, just to make it a little bit more granular and useful. And then I also added a second formula property that takes the result of this and caps it between 0 and 100%. Because if you don't have this, it's just going to keep on going past 100%, which I didn't really like. I didn't like how it looked. Next, I added a select property, the time type. This is something that's just used for filtering. You can adjust it however you like. It's just going to make it so you can say, like, I only want quarters to show up here and things like that. And that's really all there is for the time frame objects themselves, because they are intended to act as containers, like I said, to aggregate tasks. They're not really intended to be storing data on their own and calculating things on their own. So the next thing we're going to be doing is adding some of those relation properties for the tasks to show, what the overall progress is for all the tasks in this time frame and other things like that. Very simply, the first thing we need to do is add a relation, select our tasks database. And as I was building out the rollups and things, I did realize there was an issue with design, something I needed to clarify. On the one hand, any time frame can contain tasks. Those tasks may contain subtasks of their own, but they may not. And then they also can be at any level. So I may have a high level task at like a quarter time frame with subtasks at a week time frame, or I may just have tasks at the week time frame. And so since time frames can contain other time frames, I needed to decide how I wanted to roll up these progress values, because I have these two points of origin where tasks can come from. They can be assigned to the time frame directly, or they can be assigned to a sub time frame. At first I tried including both, but I realized that this would result in double counting progress for when I have subtasks assigned, because the tasks do roll up their own progress. So I decided for my purposes to just include the progress from tasks that are actually assigned to the time frame. And then I did include a second formula for anyone who wants to use it, and this one uses both and averages them, which does not give you an exact result. And then the more you sort of split your tasks up like this, the more skewed it gets. But if you do have a lot of tasks that are assigned to sub-time frames that are not being rolled up into a parent task, it may end up being more accurate for you. It's hard to say. So I've just called that one average, task progress average instead of task progress. So the way that rollup works is that it is on the task relation, the progress property, and it averages it, because that's how we're going to get the progress for the overall task, is an average of its subtasks, since it's from 0 to 100%. And then task progress average, like I mentioned, just grabs both of these values, adds them, and divides them by 2 to average them. Also, since I'm opting to use task progress only, since I am opting to use the task progress that is assigned to each time frame only, I don't need to worry about rolling up the task progress through multiple levels of the time frame hierarchy, since we're doing that already in the task database. So the top level tasks are already going to have all of their sub progress added into them. After getting the progress working, I went through and I did the same things for other summary properties. And here I really want all the same ones that the tasks have. So I want to know how many hours it's been worked on. I want to know the income overall, the income goal. So first we have task hours, which is a roll up of all hours. And then to make a nice pretty label, I'm doing the same thing with a formula property called hours label, where I am literally copying the same formatting. I have hours, the little icon, and then I put the property value in there. I go through and I add the same for income. Task income is a roll-up of the income property on the related tasks, and that is summed. The same thing for task income goal. And then using that same formatted formula, I'm going to display these just like I do on the tasks with the green dollar sign emoji, and only showing the goal if there is an amount for the goal. Now that the databases are fully set up, we've done most of the work already. If you want, you can just go rogue at this point, set up whatever views you want, build a dashboard that you want. But the process I'm going to cover is how I set up the views and the templates for this template that I'm offering. So this is how I did it. Starting with the tasks database, the default database view is just going to have all the properties. I like to have one view that does this so I can come here and make edits if I need to, see how the values are calculating out. The next view I'm adding is called All Tasks Update. And by the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about with views, for any Notion database you can create additional ways to view the data in the database. Just because you made a table initially, it doesn't always have to be a table. This particular view will be a table that I'm making now, but you can make boards, galleries, timelines, calendar views, lists, which are kind of like pared down tables. But this one's going to be a table for now. This view I'm going to keep the format pretty standard. Instead of showing all the properties, because there's a lot and it gets a little bit cluttered, I'm only going to show properties that the user will need to see or change as they're updating things, which is why I called this All Tasks Update. So things like the name, initiative, date, item effort and item total, hours logged, item income goal, the checkboxes for is work and is content. And also, if you ever want to quickly show or hide properties, you can use the ellipsis menu, click properties, and then they are all listed. They have a little eye icon next to them that you can click to show or hide them. You can also right click on the property header in the table and choose hide in view. And it's important to note that you can show or hide properties in each view and like reorganize them, and that changes the view only. But if you make changes to the property itself, like what kind of property it is, what its name is, the formula it's using, that change is kept across the entire database and all the views into that database. So remember how that works. The next view is going to be a weekly calendar view. This is a view type that is really new and I'm so excited about it. So I'm going to make a new view, choose calendar. In the settings you can select week instead of month under show calendar as. And I selected date as the date used. Remember, we have a few different date properties, but this is the sort of final one. And I'm picky about which properties I show in the calendar view because if you add too many, they just sort of stack up. They make these entries longer and longer. In fact, I've recently, after filming this video, gone back and took out even more properties so they're a little bit more compact and I could fit more on screen. But for this view, I just want to show the basics. So here is where I'm using a lot of those label properties because they look nicer and because they tell you what that value is, you can see at a glance kind of what the information is telling you. I duplicated the weekly task view to create another weekly goals view. The terminology I'm using here is kind of that goals are the high-level tasks. So this one I have filtered to only tasks which don't have a super task, meaning that they are at the top level of the hierarchy. Similarly, I've created a weekly subtask view where I've done the opposite, filtered only to tasks that don't have a subtask instead of not having a super task, meaning they're a lowest level in the hierarchy. And this is going to be useful for seeing the daily stuff, what I actually have to do in a week without having to also see those higher level goals in the view at the same time. The timelines are really useful because unlike calendars, with a timeline you can specify separate start and end dates. I don't know why they don't add this for calendars as well, honestly. And since we are generating some of our task dates, this view is helpful for seeing the date ranges in relation to each other on a consistent timeline. It's a lot more free than the calendar view, which only does monthly and weekly calendars. Next, I've done a work calendar view, which is essentially a copy of the task calendar, but it is filtered only to tasks that have is work checked. And since we know that these are all work tasks, I have opted to show more of the income properties on this one because I know that all of these are going to be income related. The gallery view type is also really good for creating visually pleasant database views. I created a gallery for the work task that looks very similar to the calendar, but instead of laid out on a calendar, it's just a gallery of little squares. This gives you a good look at, a summary of what's going on without necessarily connecting it to, time on a calendar. And next I created a content calendar. It's just like the work calendar, but instead of filtering on is work, we are filtering on is content. That's all I'm creating right now for tasks. Let's create some views for the time frames next. There's not going to be a ton of these, and I had to do some thinking on this one because the way the hierarchies show up in different views is not exactly what I wanted here. There's not really a clean way to show which time frames are contained inside other time frames. So what I kind of did was a gallery that grouped the time frames by the time frame type so that the quarter would show up on the side, all the weeks would show up on the next side. So you can use either groups for the board, which will go across in columns, or you can use a gallery that is, grouped, and that will separate them vertically, if that makes sense. You can play around with these, but in the end, what I really wanted was to be able to view all these, quarters and weeks at a glance. So having a gallery that's filtered by time frame type is also pretty useful. I did a view for that as well. And as long as I can see all those properties at a glance, the rest of it doesn't really matter that much. And that's actually the only couple views that I did for time frames, because the real meat of this project is in managing the tasks, and the time frames are just containers, so they can be a lot more simple. Now that we have our databases set up and some views prepared, I'm going to work on templates. Not to be confused with the overall template, these are templates for pages in databases. So what these are going to do is make it easy for users to create pages that look a certain way and are preloaded with useful page sections already. So I made a template on the task database, and then I realized I never went through and hid properties in the page view of these databases. So right now we can see every property that we added right here at the top, and practically speaking, a lot of these are not going to be useful. So I went through and hid anything that was a formula or a roll-up or an intermediate property that we don't need to see all the time or use ever. So anything that's sort of used to calculate something else, I have gone through and hid that because we want this to be as tidy as possible while still being useful. You can also have the relation properties show up as a page section. This is a relatively new feature as well, and I've done this for the time frame and subtask properties. And the first template I'm making is one I'm calling the Supertask goal template. This is going to be for setting up longer term tasks that will contain other tasks. At the top, I included a space to write down what the goal is for. I used a call out because I thought it would look nice with the icon and the background color. And then next, below that, I added a tasks view. I started off using a calendar view, but later I came back and changed it a little bit. I got kind of distracted by adding button automation. The buttons are pretty new to Notion, and the way that they work is that you can add a button, just slash button, and then you can configure it with up to 10 steps, and then whenever you press the button, those 10 steps will be activated and they will do whatever the steps are set to do. The steps you can use are create page in database, edit pages in a database, add a block to the page, or show an alert, a confirmation dialog. This one I want to use to batch create tasks using that date offset that I set up. The unfortunate thing is that there's no like really convenient repeat option or any variables that you can sort of pull from the page that it's in. So we can't do something as easy as, say, generate one task each week starting now. We will have to do a little bit of manual work to get this going. But what we can do is get one step set up, and then the user can duplicate the step however many times they want to repeat it, and then they can just change the offset number to change the date. Maybe in the future Notion will give us a little bit more flexibility here, but for now it will save people a little bit of time if they're creating a lot of very similar tasks. So for this button, I have added the Add Page To step within the tasks database, and then I set the Supertask to this page, the origin date to today, the date offset to 0, and then the date offset type to days. So when the user wants to batch create tasks, they can come in here, adjust the origin date and the name and the date offset type, and then they can just duplicate it for each task they want, up to 10. It can have up to 10 steps in a button, and then they'll just change the offset for each of those copies. So it's fairly easy. It's as easy as I could make it. I'm also adding a button to sync task statuses, and we're going to reuse this button in a couple different places. The way that this works is that I use the Edit Pages step. I have 2 steps, and the user won't need to edit these since they're not based on anything that changes from page to page. So when you use an edit step in a button, you can create a filter the same way you would on a database view. And I'm using this filter to get the tasks that need to be set to done. And I also want to filter only tasks that are relevant to this page. So Supertask contains Supertask goal, adds a second filter that says progress is greater than or equal to 1. I did put 100 in here during the recording, but I realized later the progress is a percentage, so it goes from 0 to 1, not 0 to 100. So I fixed that later, but this should say 1. And so if it is 1, that means it's 100% complete, it's done. We use the step to set the status value to done. The next step is almost exactly the same, so we can just duplicate it and change the things we need to change. So we want to add a filter group, so where the progress is greater than 0 and less than 1, because we don't want to include complete tasks. And instead of setting it to done, this is going to set the status to doing. Now back to the tasks view, I'm adding a table to view all of the subtasks. And because the focus of this one is to view information, we don't really want the edit properties in here. So I just have a table with the critical info like name, initiative, status, and then the summary properties, as I'll call them, like progress, hours label, metric label, anything we want to see at a glance, perhaps the income label as well. Next, I did add the subtask update view, which we talked briefly about before. And we do want to filter it to subtasks that are contained within this supertask. So any tasks where the supertask is this supertask goal object. And then we just want to make sure that the properties that are showing are all relevant to updating task information. Since we added this view to the database, we should just be able to use that and add the filter, and everything else should be good. Next, I added the weekly calendar view, filtered 2 tasks within this supertask goal. Moving up the page a little, I slipped in a section for goal notes. This is really kind of like the description area, what sorts of information I need to complete this goal, maybe little progress updates if it's a longer term task, just a nice text area that the user can plug that information into. And then finally, I did something that I think is really cool. So if you have a calendar, or I think a timeline will work as well, you can drag related pages from another database view onto that calendar to set the date. So what I did was I created a toggle section so I could hide this if I didn't need it. And within that toggle section, I added a monthly view of tasks that we're going to use to drag things in from that upper view. The important thing here is to make this monthly calendar view use the set date. If we try to use date, because it's a formula, we can't set that from the calendar, so it's just not going to work. We can only set dates this way if we are using a date type property. That also means that any task that has the date offset is not going to show up here because the set date for those is blank, unless we manually set it to whatever the offset was. But that's fine. This view is a tool for scheduling. It's not really a view for looking at your tasks. That's why it's in this little expandable drop-down thing. And now, once we set that, it's very easy. We can just drag things from the top view down into this calendar and use that to set the set date. And this is all I really wanted for the Supertask goal template. Next, I worked on another task template. This was a simpler one, the content piece template. I tried to make this somewhat generic so that people using this template could easily edit it to fit their needs. It's not too complicated, but this represents a piece of content that you're creating over and over again. And it's meant to make the creation of tasks related to that content very quick. So in this one, I have a call out space for the title of the content piece, several toggles, one where you can write out the body of the content, a script maybe, filming notes. I often write YouTube scripts in Notion. I'm writing this one in Notion right now. I also write Medium articles in Notion, so I would do that here. Next, a link and resources section to put any links, things I need to research or whatever, things I want to include in the description maybe. And then a metadata section for things like tags, notes about the thumbnail perhaps, or I could even drop the thumbnail in here, whatever kind of metadata you need for your content piece. Next, I added another button, going a little crazy with the buttons, and this one generates subtasks, just like one of our other buttons does. But this one's going to be a little bit more detailed because we're going to use this to automatically generate the subtasks that we need for this piece of content. Since I want this to be as generic as possible, I'm making this a very simple process. You can always go into the templates later if you've grabbed this Notion template off my shop, but I added 3 steps to create new tasks, one to write, one to edit, and one to publish. And I'm using the date offset here to offset these tasks from each other based on a typical schedule. So I have one write task being added with the origin date set to today, the offset at 0. I have an edit task being added, also with an origin of today, but with an offset of 3. So this will end up being, 3 days after on the day I press this button. And then finally a published task with an origin of today and an offset of 5. And the super task for all of these is this page. So when I click this button, I will get 3 subtasks for this content piece task, and the dates at today, 3 days from now, and 5 days from now. The last thing I added to the content piece template is a little board to manage those subtasks. This is just a board view with the tasks filtered to only tasks that have this content piece as a super task. And the board is grouped by status. So this is your typical Kanban style board with the columns for status, to do, doing, and done. And as always, as I create these templates and different automations, I take a step back between and I run through the use cases, I plug in some test data, and make sure everything is working. I'm also making a couple templates for the timeframes. These are the bulk of where I spend my time as I'm using these templates because it's where everything comes together for each week or quarter. I started with a call out where you could summarize your thoughts about the time frame. This quarter I want to ... A little prompt for thinking about your aspirations and something you can revisit whenever you look at this page. These pages are also areas where I do some planning. So my next section is a text section titled Brainstorm, where you can journal out your thoughts. Maybe do this in a separate page and link that page here if you want to do that. And then when you move on to actually setting concrete goals, all those thoughts will be in one place, right above the next section, which is a tasks view for top level goals. This view is a table and is filtered only to tasks that don't have a super task, and their time frame relation is set to this time frame. I've also duplicated this from all task update, so we should have the right properties visible already. I've also added some other useful views here, one being a goals gallery, which is a gallery filtered to the same things. It's filtered to tasks with this time frame, no Supertask, so they are at the top level. And then I've also added a timeline with the same filters, just a couple different ways to view all of the big top level goals that are assigned to this long time frame. Below the task views, I've added a time frame view, and since this template is for long time frames, I know that it will likely contain smaller time frames, though it doesn't have to. This view is so that we can see the overall progress in those time frames and also navigate between them easily. Next, I added a space to view all of the tasks filtered to this time frame. So something you may want to do here differently than I've done is filter by date, because what will happen here is that if you have a system where you create subtasks for your goals and you assign those subtasks to a smaller time frame, it's not going to show up under this filter. But I think that's okay for now. This is kind of how I wanted to use it. But that's just a little note that if you assign your tasks to a different time frame, even though they're the subtasks of these goals, if you expand, they will not show up here. Below that, I'm adding a results section. Sometimes I want to track metrics over time for things like my fitness indicators, like resting heart rate, my YouTube subscriptions, maybe website visits, different things. And I might not want to make a whole database for it. So I added a table here so I could keep track of these numbers over the time frame. And you can use this or not, whatever you want. I just thought it might be useful to some people, so I included it in the template. And then finally, I'm adding a retrospective section. This is where I write down my thoughts at the end of the time frame. The end of the quarter, the end of whatever. I think about what went well, what didn't go well, and I come up with things that I want to change next time. I also added another button automation I'm really happy with. It's a button that will find all unassigned top-level tasks that are within the dates for this time frame and assign them to this time frame. This makes it so I can create goals on the dashboard or somewhere else. I can click this one button and just scoop them all up. And this one does require the user to edit the dates because of limitations with Notion, but it just has the one edit task step, and the filter includes filters to make sure that they don't already have a time frame, they don't have a super task, so they're at the top level, and then there's a filter group that makes sure the start date and the end date are both within the time frame, because I found that filtering for is between doesn't always work the way I expect it to when I have a date range that only partially overlaps. And so the user will need to come in here and edit that date filter to make sure it is the correct date. And then a little later, I realized I forgot something and I came back. I wanted a button to generate many sub time frames beneath this time frame. This is a step that always took me kind of a long time when setting up my 12-week year, because I would have to go in and create manually 12 weeks within the quarter. So having a button to do it is pretty simple. Of course, I can only do this in, batches of 10 or less, but it still saves me a bit of time. It works the same way that task generation button does, where it has a step that defines an origin date, a date offset, an offset type. You can also set the name, you can change what kind of time frame it is, whatever you want. And then I duplicate this step, and then I just change the offset for each one. And that way, with a click of this button, I can create a bunch of sub time frames, and it's much quicker than the manual method I was doing before. The next template, and I believe the last template, is the short time frame template. This is intended to be used for short time periods where you are acting on the day-to-day work. So the long time frame template is more for planning in advance, big picture stuff, and then this one is more for checking in and doing your daily action. I started by putting in some sections that I know I will need for this: plan, tasks, and retrospective. For this one, we don't really need a big brainstorm section or a lot of aspirational reminders, because hopefully by the time we get to this template, we should have things planned out already. We should be connected to that bigger picture, and we're just worried about the details, the short-term goals. In the task section, I added views for my task database, as you might expect. And my favorite piece of this whole template is the weekly tasks view. I use this every day to see how things are going and plan things out and shuffle things around. And I'm just really happy that Notion added the weekly calendar view. Just above the task view, I am going to add another button, just like the one in the long time frame template, that will automatically add tasks to this time frame. The only difference is that instead of looking for top level tasks or tasks that don't have a super task, I'm going to look for low level tasks or tasks that don't have a subtask. If you want to set your button up differently, you can definitely do that, but the way this template is designed assumes that the top level tasks will be assigned to long time frames, and the lower level, more detailed tasks will be assigned to the short time frame. The button steps for this look very similar to what we did before. We just want to change the filter so it looks for tasks with no subtasks rather than no supertasks, and it pretty much should just work. I've also added the sync task status button to this one as well. You could probably just copy paste the button from the other template to this one, but it was simple enough that I just rebuilt it with those two steps. One, to set the status to done if the progress is 1 or more, which it shouldn't be more, but just in case. And then the other step to set the status to doing if it's between 0 and 1. I've also added a couple of other views in here, the first being the task update table view. This is the same view we've seen a couple times where it's a table and all the properties that are visible are properties that you will want to edit for different tasks. So no formulas, no like summary tasks, just the stuff that you actually input information into. And I want to make sure that I'm filtering that to only tasks that are within this time frame. Then the last view that I added was a board view that groups tasks by status. So this is another pretty basic Kanban style board. So you can see the status of everything at a glance and drag and drop the cards to change their statuses. And then finally I went through and hid all the page properties that we don't need to see. I made the subtimes page sections just for the ease of navigation, and I reorganized the properties so that the ones you're most likely to edit are near the top, and then the ones that are just for reviewing are closer to the bottom, and all the ones that are in like intermediate that you use for something else or that are completely calculated and not useful to look at are all hidden. So the properties on here are a lot cleaner now. Sorry if it was bothering you. It took me a while to get around to it. After I got this template working, I went back and forth editing test data, trying out the template, seeing how the buttons worked, and making sure that I'm testing the template and fixing any little bugs that might have come up. And then, for the most part, we're ready to move on to the next exciting step, building out the dashboard. We are almost done here. I started off the dashboard by putting the most high-level stuff at the very top, the top-level timeframes, which should roll up all of the task progress and the progress through the time frame, and then the top-level goals are both right at the very top. I already had database views for these, so I just plopped them in here. And I did make a little change to the time frame gallery. Instead of filtering by time frame type, I'm just making it so that there's a filter for only time frames without a super time frame. So this will get everything at the top level like we've been doing with tasks. We're just going to show the highest level summaries right here at the top. For the goals, I actually did a gallery and a table just to give a little diversity in how people can view this information. It's the same information, it's just laid out a little bit differently. This is where you can see your goal progress and just get a nice overhead view of how that's going. And if you didn't know, a relatively new feature of Notion is columns that are kind of natively supported. You used to have to do a hacky little maneuver to get certain types of blocks to go into a column. Now you can just type /column and pick the number you want, and it will create the columns for you with empty blocks, and you can just drag stuff in or add things however you like. I also threw in a button, the sync task button, but that runs on all the tasks in the database. I put this at the bottom of the dashboard in a little section I'm calling automations. This will be really handy for me because for some reason I consistently forget to update task statuses. I don't know why. Next, I wanted a section for all the time frames, and I came up with this new view. It's a gallery grouped by the time frame type. And I went back and forth between a lot of different options, so I'll probably clip a lot of that out, but basically what I really want is to flip the board so it's going in rows instead of columns. I just think for this particular information it would look better and be easier to read on the page like this. These view options really kind of lend themselves to a vertical view rather than a horizontal view. But what this should look like when it's full, full, whatever that looks like for you, is a couple of rows at the top with your highest level time frame, like quarters for me, and then your weeks on separate rows below that. Below the time frame gallery, I added a full tasks update view, a table that shows all the tasks, and then a calendar view of all the tasks, and these are side by side in a 2-column layout. And one thing I did in the video was set the filters for what tasks show up here based on date, and I ended up changing it just a little bit so that the new filter it's either, so an or filter, not done, so the status is not a done status, or, and then this is a filter group, the start date and the end dates are on or after 1 week ago. And the reason I changed this is because I wanted to make sure long-running tasks showed up, even if their start date was a long time ago, as long as their end date was within the past week. The task calendar is filtered the same way, just because I thought this was a good way to filter relevant tasks. I also added a filter to this one that only shows subtasks, so only tasks with a parent task, because showing the top level tasks was creating these large kind of ugly bars across the whole top of the calendar. Next, I added a section I called income review, which shows a few views that display work tasks. And remember, I had that work item gallery view, so I used that. And then I also added a table in case people prefer to view these in a table. After recording, I went back and I shuffled a couple things around just for the sake of organization, but here it is in its final form. I've been using it for the past 2 weeks now in Q2 of 2023. I even backfilled a little bit of data from Q1 just to see how it would look all filled in, and now it's done. Woo! I'm hoping I can cut down this video pretty good, but in real life, this template took me several days, probably about 10 hours. So this is a big project. Don't feel bad if you need to take breaks or, revisit some earlier parts of the video. It's going to be here for you if you need that. And since it is a template, one step I didn't show here is that I did go through and delete all the test data from the template, so people who grab it on KoFi can have a fresh copy, a blank copy, and just fill it with their own information. So for my own uses, I have duplicated the template to a different place in my Notion, and that's the one that I use day to day. But this is it, from start to finish, how I made my newest Notion template. I know I had to necessarily summarize a lot of the stuff here, kind of go over it very quickly. Feel free to ask questions if you have any, and I will do my best to answer them. But I hope this helped. I hope this taught you a little bit about Notion. Thank you so much for watching. This was a huge effort for me, but I'm really happy with it. And like I mentioned, you can just purchase the template on my Ko-fi shop if you don't want to go through the trouble of building it. Or, of course you can just build it yourself following this entire video. Well, that's all I have today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because I will be back soon with another video, and I hope to see you there. Bye bye.